Hi everybody, and welcome to this webinar, which has been put on by the amazing ICW, which I'll talk to you about in a moment. And the topic we are discussing today is cosmetics. So cosmetic regulatory challenges in the EU and beyond. For those of you that have attended previous ICW webinars, thank you so much for coming back. I would love to ask you at this point, actually, if you have any suggestions about future webinars, then please do let us know in the chat, because we are excitedly planning 2025 and what webinars we're going to put on for you, and they are for you. So please do let us know if you want to put it in the chat, or we've got the email here, as you can see, e-marketing@icw.io. So get in contact with us and let us know what you think about these webinars and also what you'd like to see in 2025. As you know, for participation, please do actively participate. These sessions are for you. So any questions you have, put them in the chat. We can't promise to answer all of them in the time that we have. We've only got 45 minutes. So it's a really short time, but please do put them in the chat and we'll try and get back in contact with you and follow up with you if we don't get to answer them during this webinar. And also you can contact us. You shouldn't be able to unmute, but just in case you are, please make sure that you mute your lines. And these webinars are being recorded, so we're not going to mention anyone's name specifically. I'll see some familiar names coming through, and it's lovely to see you back, but we won't call those out. But we may announce some of the questions coming through the webinar when they come through. Okay, so very, very briefly, I'll introduce myself. You've probably heard this quite a few times, so I'll keep it brief before the stars of the show introduce themselves and the experts on cosmetics. But before we do that, very, very quickly, I'm Geraldine Koch. It's an absolute pleasure and I'm really excited. I'm always excited to spend time with Amanda and the lovely team at Bloom Regulatory to talk about cosmetics and understand more. And I'm still learning every time I hear. So I'm a product safety consultant. I've worked in product safety for years, for 20 years, done lots of training sessions, which I really, really enjoy. I've also done some recent activities, so technical through a British standard, and worked at EU level and also as an expert witness. And most recently worked with the Chartered Trading Standards Institute with the BCCPS, which is the Business Certificate of Competency in Product Safety, which is a great training session that's available for businesses. Okay, so very quickly, I want to talk to you about ICW, and then I'm going to pass over to the lovely Amanda and Layla. ICW is an amazing system. For those of you that have never used it, do reach out to me if you're interested to learn more. And the reason why I love it so much is it saves time and money, because time is money as well a lot of the time, in the admin side of compliance. So it really does help with the collaboration with other organizations and also the consolidation of testing and inspections and compliance documents and reports that you may have, and you may get overwhelmed with them because there's so many. So the ICW system helps organize all of that, make it all nice and tidy, but then also use the data to summarize maybe where you need to focus your efforts, maybe where your failures are happening, or maybe where you need to work on specific products, or where you're investing on. So it's a really, really vital tool that I highly recommend. And if you want to know anything more about it, then do let me know. Just one more slide, just to show you information that you can get out of the system. So looking at what type of assessments, you can see the standards there. Are you looking at chemical flammability? I know chemical is an issue for cosmetics for sure, but you can begin to get that picture with the data that you get that's uploaded into the system to understand where you need to focus. So that was a brief introduction to the ICW system. Any questions, let me know, and you can reach out to me, but I'm going to pass over to Amanda and Layla.
Okay, thank you, Geraldine. Hi, everyone. So just a little introduction to me. So I'm Regulatory Affairs Director at a company called Bloom Regulatory. We're a regulatory consultancy specialising in cosmetics, but also food supplements as well. We offer a range of different services, compliance, regulatory, and also strategy support. And I'm very lucky to have been working at Bloom for 4 years and within this lovely industry, the cosmetic industry, for over 25 years now. And I'm also pleased to be invited back today. So thank you, ICW, for having us back again. And I'd just like to introduce my colleague, Layla, who's going to introduce herself a little bit more as well.
Thanks, Amanda. Hi, everyone. I'm Layla. I'm Regulatory Affairs Manager working alongside Amanda at Bloom Regulatory. I graduated back in 2020 from the London College of Fashion with an MSc in Cosmetic Science and straight away joined the team at Bloom. So I've been here for the last 4 years, learning all about the regulatory world and supporting businesses with their food supplement products, cosmetic products, and also general products as well.
Thank you, Layla. Okay, so on to why we're here today. We're going to talk about cosmetic regulatory challenges in the EU and beyond. So I think we all know every year is challenging. This year is no different. So looking back at 2024 and looking forward at 2025 is certainly not going to be any different either. We are going to look at some of the changes that have happened and are happening in the cosmetics regulation, focusing UK, EU. But at Bloom, we've started to realise that being compliant with the cosmetics regulation really is starting to look like perhaps only 10% of the compliance for your finished product. So what we are starting to look at now, even just at product level, so we're not touching manufacturing or any other regulations. We have ingredient restrictions coming from elsewhere. We have packaging restrictions starting to come into force, and lots of advertising constraints as well. So just at that product level, we're really starting to see a lot that has absolutely nothing to do with the cosmetics regulation. So we're going to take you into those areas a little bit today as well and give you a bit of an introduction to those. So we're going to start off with the finished product safety area and ingredient focus for UK and EU.
Thanks, Amanda. So we'll start off with the key updates to the EU cosmetics legislation this year. We saw 2 main amendments. So the first was published in March of this year, Commission Regulation 2024/858, which introduced a nano ban to a group of ingredients, which includes things like copper, colloidal silver, also gold and colloidal gold as well. These have been reviewed by the SCCS, or the Scientific Committee on Consumer Safety, over the past few years, and the conclusion has led to ultimately these ingredients being banned for use in cosmetics, so they've been added to our Annex 2. There is some transition periods in place for these group of ingredients. So we've got the deadline, first of all, for placing new products on the market, which is our sooner deadline of the 1st of February 2025. And then for making available existing stock, which contains those ingredients, is the 1st of November 2025, so a little bit longer. The second amendment to the regulation followed quite shortly after, in about April, and this is Regulation 2024/996, which added a group of ingredients to Annex 3, which is our list of restricted ingredients. This included things like kojic acid, alpha-arbutin, there's the list you can see on the screen, but most notably, this introduced a restriction to retinol and 2 of its derivatives, retinyl acetate and retinyl palmitate, which were previously unrestricted. So this is quite a shift for industry. So again, there are some transition periods in place for those restrictions. It's been restricted in body lotion at a slightly lower level, and then also other leave-on and rinse-off products as well. The deadlines for placing new products on the market is 1st of November 2025. So if you are placing new products on the market with those ingredients, it is important to be aware of the levels that are allowed. And then for making available existing stock, businesses have until the 1st of May 2027, so quite a bit longer for those ones. We can go to the next slide. I'm just going to talk through the key amendment to the UK cosmetics legislation this year. We've only had one. We are very slowly playing catch up over here in the UK. So just for background, since the UK left the European Union back in 2020 now, we took the annexes from the EU as they were. So any updates to the EU legislation is not automatically adopted in Great Britain. So yes, we are very slowly playing catch up, and this is something that was restricted in the European Union back at the end of 2022. And we've just got through the restriction in GB in July of this year. So that is to restrict butylated hydroxytoluene, or more commonly known as BHT, in the following groups of products. So in toothpaste, mouthwash, leave-on oral care products, and other leave-on and rinse-off products. And again, there are some transition periods in place. So for placing new products on the market, not complying with those restrictions, we have until 24th of February 2025. And then for making available existing stock not complying with the restrictions, businesses have until the 24th of June 2025. So that brings me to my next slide, is where have we started to see divergence between the EU and UK? As I say, the changes in the EU are not automatically adopted in the UK, and we are starting to see some differences. So for BHT specifically, as I said, it was restricted quite some time ago in the EU, so the transition periods have now passed and the restriction is fully in place for new and existing stock. I'd also like to note that there are a difference between product categories in both regions. So in the UK, we have this leave-on oral care product category, which is not present in the EU restriction. So it is possible that an EU compliant product will not be compliant in GB. Another example where we see divergence is the kojic acid restriction. Again, this was published earlier in the year in the EU, as I mentioned, but is currently in draft to be restricted in GB. So we have differences. And then also with the deadlines, there are longer transition periods for GB, as it's not technically published yet. It will be the same for things like retinol, because it's been now restricted in the EU, but there's no restriction in GB. So it's just important to keep in mind that EU compliance doesn't guarantee GB compliance, and vice versa as well. If we can go to the next slide. Thanks, Amanda. So I just wanted to touch on tea tree oil, as this is an ingredient that's very widely used in the cosmetics industry. But earlier this year, we did see in both GB and EU proposed classification under CLP and equivalent regulation, which is the classification, labelling and packaging regulation. The proposal is for reprotoxic 1B, which is a CMR classification. And under Article 15 of the cosmetics regulation, anything classified as CMR under CLP will automatically become banned under the cosmetic regulation. So this could be quite an issue for the cosmetics industry if the classification does go ahead. The SCCS have issued a mandate in the EU to potentially find safe levels for a restriction when tea tree is used as, I think it's an anti-seborrheic agent and an antimicrobial agent. So there is potential for that, but obviously if the classification does go ahead, then there is potential for tea tree oil and its ingredients to be banned under the cosmetic regulation. But for now, we can still continue to use these ingredients and formulas as the classification is not final. Okay, so the last slide from me here is just to touch on the fragrance allergen regulation, which was published back in July of 2023. This regulation adds 56 new fragrance allergens compared to the original 26 allergens, so it adds quite a few, which will really impact the labelling of your ingredients lists on cosmetic products. Because of the amount of now identified fragrance allergens, the regulation does introduce a grouping approach. So the example we've got on the screen, sorry, it's a little bit small, but we've got Pinus mugo, leaf and twig oil and extract. So if those ingredients are present as an allergen above threshold in your product, then these can be indicated as Pinus mugo. You do not need to list the full INCI names when present as an allergen. As this is quite a shift for businesses, there are again transition periods in place. So for placing new products on the market, the deadline to have the new updated ingredients list will be the 31st of July 2026. and for making available existing stock that doesn't contain the new fragrance allergens, businesses have until the 31st of July 2028.
Thank you, Layla. So Layla's obviously talked quite a bit there about the changes that have already happened that are different between, we've used UK and sometimes we've used GB, just to explain there is a reason we do that. We are calling it UK a lot of the time because that is the government that we have, but the legislation itself applies in GB. So you will hear us sometimes go between those two terms, but for a reason. But going forward, the situation could get a lot broader than just ingredient restrictions, because within the UK at the moment we have a proposal going through for a product regulation and metrology bill. What that means is it is setting the future framework in order to make changes to regulations in terms of wider changes. So actually changing the law completely, for example, would obviously be the worst case scenario for businesses anticipating that. But what we have then is that going through at the moment, so that in the future we may have a completely new cosmetic regulation, as just as one example. That was something we've kind of expected for a few years now since leaving the EU, but we also knew that the EU was considering looking at the cosmetics regulation from the EU side as well. And that is now coming to fruition. It should have happened this year, but it is now planned for discussion in 2025 with a 2026 adoption possible. Now, it's potentially not as all-encompassing in terms of change as maybe UK legislation might be, but it does still potentially bring with it some things that we are currently expecting, and of course discussions still to happen, so we could have other things coming later. But we do expect, for example, the nanomaterial definition to change to go in line with the new overarching definition in the EU, which would ultimately mean a lot more substances will be considered nanomaterials for inside cosmetics. And we can expect endocrine disruptor restrictions. So where we currently have the CMR, the carcinogenic, mutagenic, reprotoxic, we can expect that endocrine disruptors, at least category 1, are likely to have some restrictions automatically in cosmetics as well. And I put there in inverted commas the EGD, so that's European Green Deal. So part of the overall initiative that you'll hear over and over again in so many different settings, it is the move towards a safer and more environmentally sustainable Europe, and that is just part of that. Okay, so we talked a lot about ingredients. We are going to come back to some ingredients again in a minute, but under a different setting. So first of all, I'm just going to have a little consideration of online listings. Now, some of you may well have attended the GPSR webinar that Geraldine mentioned earlier. And of course, if you did, you'll be an absolute expert in this topic, and you will already know what all the general product safety regulation is about. But we do have sector legislation for cosmetics. So generally speaking, this regulation doesn't apply to cosmetics, but that's not the case for absolutely everything, because the general rule is if the provision isn't in sector legislation, then the general product safety regulation will apply. And where that comes into being now is, although our UK legislation remains as it was pre-EU exit, so we're on the old General Product Safety Directive, confusingly called the General Product Safety Regulation in the UK, and then in the EU we have the new General Product Safety Regulation by the same name, but this introduces requirements to allow consumers to safely shop online as well as physically. And what that means is publishing safety warnings, and that will include ingredient lists in the case of cosmetics. So for online listings, we will need to include our warnings and our ingredient lists online. Okay, and I wanted to talk as well about hidden impurities. This is a safety concern always, but this has arisen and is coming up more and more around the world. So less of a focus at the moment in the EU and UK, but we are seeing more and more focus in the US on impurities. For many, many years, we've had what's known as Proposition 65, which identifies chemicals known as causing cancer or birth defects. Apologies for the split across the line there of the text. And on that list, you have over 900 chemicals. It doesn't mean you can't use them, but it means if you have them present in your product, so not just added to your product deliberately, so this is why we talk about impurities, but present in your product, then you need to include a warning label that very obviously tells consumers that your product contains something that might cause cancer. This includes things like heavy metals and PFAS and a number of other, as I said, 900 chemicals. What we expect to happen in January is that Washington has now taken a focus on lead, and they have put a very, very low limit of 1 part per million, which is a huge problem for colour cosmetics. So we have this focus going on in these particular US states, but there are many others, because in the US we have federal law and we have state law, and a lot of these aspects are coming up in state law. So to sell across the US, you've got to look at each individual state as well. But as I said, although it's not controlled as much in the EU when we talk about ingredients and cosmetics, impurities are always relevant to safety. So they are something that obviously are always in our minds. Okay, so I'm going to go back to ingredients again now, but the reason that we separated this particular section is that everything that Layla was talking about earlier comes from the cosmetics regulation. And now I want to talk to you about chemical legislation. So in terms of the EU, what I'm talking about is classification, labelling and packaging, CLP, and I'm just going to say REACH for ease there. You can read the rest on the slide. The REACH regulation. So these are our two key chemical regulations in the EU. So the CLP applies to chemicals and chemical mixtures. Technically speaking, it doesn't apply to cosmetics, in that cosmetics have their own legislation that says how you label them. So you don't have to follow the labelling provisions of the CLP regulation, except for aerosols, where there are specific aspects that you need to include. And there is also the dynamic link that we've mentioned a couple of times. So when Layla was talking about tea tree oil, when I've just mentioned endocrine disruptors potentially in the future, the dynamic link between what gets classified under CLP and an automatic prohibition into Annex 2 of the cosmetics regulation. So although we're not part of CLP as such, there is definite relevance there. But the one that I want to highlight more is REACH. Now, the cosmetics regulation deals only with human safety, whereas REACH has an additional focus of worker exposure and also environmental safety. And what this means is we can't currently, with the cosmetics regulation, restrict ingredients for environmental purposes. So if something is a threat to the environment, the only way to restrict that in a cosmetic is to do so through the REACH regulation. And this is why we now need to keep a closer eye on REACH than perhaps we might have done in the past. So for example, cyclomethicones D4, D5, D6, microplastics, and maybe potentially PFAS as well in the future are all coming through as restrictions under REACH. So we already have microplastics, obviously has a definition attached to that on what a microplastic is. We won't go into that today, but just to highlight what that means is we have a phasing out of what we're terming microplastics over the next 12 years, it was at the time of publication. So coming out of the different product types as time progresses, unless your product fits under a particular exemption. So for example, if the characteristics of the microplastic are permanently modified at the industrial site, so they are effectively not a microplastic anymore, they are modified during the intended use, so again they cease to be a microplastic, or they are permanently incorporated into a solid matrix, so they can't escape to the environment, because that's the important aspect here. We're trying to stop release to the environment. So one example is nail polish containing a microplastic for film forming. Once it becomes a film on the nails, it is no longer a microplastic, according to the definition, potentially. Not blanket, but potentially. D4, D5, D6, we have a number of different regulations under the REACH regulation that have introduced these. So there is a different set of timelines here, depending whether it's rinse off or leave on. But ultimately, I think where we are at the end is, with the limit being 0.1%, it's effectively a ban on using D4, D5 or D6 in a cosmetic product. And certainly by the time we reach the longest of those deadlines in 2027. And then finally, PFAS. So obviously, again, a very popular topic around the world. In the EU, we already have certain subcategories of PFAS that have restrictions in place. And when I talk about restrictions, I'm really talking about a ban in reality. So we have PFOA, PFOS, PFCA already in place. And then we have the recent adoption of a further subgroup, PFHXA, with a deadline on that as well. But behind all of that, we do still have a universal PFAS restriction under discussion. So at some point in the future, of course, it's very likely that these will be lost from use by many industries, obviously not just cosmetics. Internationally, as I said, it's very interesting around the world. The US has quite a focus, but of course individual US states have an even greater focus, so there is not alignment there. What we are doing as an industry is recommending to remove them as ingredients, but again, let's watch out for impurities. They can come from manufacturing equipment, for example, so we need to be careful that finished product doesn't contain those, even though we didn't actually put them there. Okay, I'll hand back to Layla again for a few slides.
Thank you. So yes, so on kind of the similar wavelength but slightly different topic, packaging is another area that is impacting the cosmetics regulation. There's a lot going on in the EU at the moment with specific regards to the European Green Deal, and this is one area that is being affected. So the Packaging and Packaging Waste Directive was first published in 1994 and amended for the final time in 2018. But as part of the European Green Deal, this directive is now being turned into a regulation which will replace the directive. So this is currently in draft, awaiting publication. But encompasses the following: so enhancing packaging design to encourage reuse and recycling, creating obligations surrounding specific recycled content in packaging, implementing obligations around excessive packaging, the same for implementing obligations around packaging waste management, and also introducing harmonised sorting instructions across member states. The regulation will also introduce some requirements around substances of concern to ensure that they are minimised, and it will also ensure that certain heavy metals do not exceed a limit of 100 milligrams per kilograms. So it's really important that companies know and control the substances in their packaging and ensure that this information is available via their packaging suppliers. The regulation will also introduce some requirements around recyclability and recycled content. So we don't have too long. So from the 1st of January 2030, all packaging must be recyclable. And then there are some requirements around the recycled content from that date as well. So for contact sensitive packaging, which does include cosmetic packaging, anything made from PET should have a minimum of 30% recycled content. And then anything made from materials other than PET shall have a minimum of 10% recycled content. And then from the 1st of January 2040, the percentage of recycled content for all contact-sensitive packaging, whether PET or not, will increase to 50%. And then just lastly, on the PPWR, the aim is to introduce a harmonised label and harmonised sorting instructions across member states. At the moment, there are quite a few different sorting instructions being implemented and also still being introduced in places like France, Italy, Spain, and Portugal, which usually highlight the materials and also the waste stream that material should go in. So whether it's glass, paper, plastic, etc. We did see an EU consultation in September of this year, which has now closed, which explored potentially how that could look like. So looks at things like the waste streams, colours, symbols for bins and things like that. We do foresee this to be quite challenging, as even between where me and Amanda live, we have different collections and bins and things like that. So to harmonise across all member states, we envision to be quite challenging. So it'll be interesting to see how that moves forward.
Thank you, Layla. So thinking about these kind of aspects on a more global scale, I don't think it will be surprising to anyone to realise that all of the things in that EU regulation are also being considered elsewhere around the world. And of course, some places already have requirements, some of them have deadlines. The one thing to remember, of course, about extended producer responsibility is it's very localised. So even under the EU, we are still going to be talking country by country slight requirements versus paying for one fee potentially across the whole of the EU. But this is not always impacting the person who made the product. It often impacts the distributors, but of course you will need to help them with what they need to do and what they need to know. The good news is that under the more modern extended producer responsibility schemes, we do have modulated fees starting to be used. And what that means is if you design your product packaging in a way that the recycled content and the recyclability are considered to be sustainable features of that, you are likely to not have to pay as much in extended producer responsibility. So that is obviously an incentive, and that's why it's there, to make you use or produce recyclable packaging. Recyclability and recycled content, we saw obviously the 2030 deadline for the EU. As I said, there will be deadlines around the world. So whilst we might be thinking, oh, it's nice, I've got till 2030, obviously make sure that for somewhere else it's not 2026 or 2028, because obviously you need to work to the strictest deadline. The other things under recycled content, the EU is quite specific. It's post-consumer recyclate. So we know that we've had some packaging presented to us. Someone's asked us an opinion on whether it would be compliant under the new rules. It was post-industrial recyclate, so potentially not. But that brings up the question of, do you need to consider each individual item, or can you use the mass balance approach across the whole of your portfolio of packaging? It will, of course, depend on the rules where you're putting that packaging. Okay, so I skipped this one a little bit earlier, but I thought, well, you're going to see it again anyway, so it doesn't matter. So just to summarise, really, we said at the beginning, cosmetic compliance isn't just about cosmetic regulations. It is becoming more and more complex. Traditionally, it's been all about safety. It's still about safety, but it's now also about the environment as well. And that's about during the whole life cycle, but also obviously heavily about the end of life fate or waste connected with a product as well. And then alongside that, you've also got the transparency demands of the modern consumer as well. So we saw obviously the fragrance allergen information being extended, and of course our online listings. So I think the real message is ensure you keep up to date, but ensure you keep up to date not just with the cosmetics regulation, but anything else that impacts putting that cosmetic on the market. Okay.
Thank you so much. That was so interesting. Every time I hear you, Amanda and the team, I've written so many notes. I can't understand what I've written, but it's just so impressive. Yes, my writing is terrible. But the one thing, tea tree oil. So I'm not going to be able to use tea tree oil anymore, potentially. I'll have to I'll have to think about that, but well, it depends, right? They're all case by case and how you do it. But really, really interesting. And thank you so much for those deadlines. I think that's really clear for people, but possibly a little bit overwhelming as well. So if there's any questions or you want to ask, we've got a few there. I'm going to go through them now. Please do direct them to the ICW team. Some of these requirements, the packaging, right, it's not just going to be for cosmetics, that's going to be for all. And
No,
the pressure we have.
absolutely. Yeah.
The pressures we have, and that really confuses me sometimes, to be honest, because is something really, you know, recyclable, and is it making it better? It's a real challenge. So a few of the questions that came in, the first question that came in, well, the first comment that came in was somebody for future webinar wanted to learn about nanomaterials. And I think it's great you've touched on those, so maybe that's addressed that, but that was really useful. So if there's any other future topics that's made you think about, please do put them in, and we'll keep that one in mind as well. Somebody's asked specifically in Washington, so for the Washington law, does it apply only to just intentionally added lead or unintentionally added lead as well?
Unintentionally, yeah.
So
So all of the impurities in all of the colours that, yeah, we know often contain lead. It's a topic that's being discussed. The US Trade Association is constantly in dialogue with the I think it's the environmental department of the Washington, do you call that? I guess it's not a government, but those legislators, because it's in law. So now it's about the application of it. So they are discussing that. They are discussing whether it may be possible to have any delays for certain product types, and how it may be possible to control that in a way that doesn't obviously mean unsafe products or environmentally unsafe products either.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you for that. And somebody asked a question and then somebody answered it, so you can jump in if this isn't correct. But somebody asked about the European Commission and the Q&A on microplastics. I know you're not the European Commission here, but they asked if the Q&A on microplastic has been published yet. Somebody did reply. I'm not sure if you got to see it, but they thought it was available on the European Commission website. So
I actually can't remember for certain off the top of my head.
Okay, so we'd have to double check. Yeah.
There is another one though that might be useful if you are talking about cosmetics specifically, because I think EFSI, the ingredient suppliers trade association, have also produced a guideline, so that one might be useful specifically for cosmetics.
What was that again? Was that an acronym?
EFSI, yes, EFFCI.
Oh, EFFCI. There you go.
Yeah, they have a guidance document which is jointly produced actually with Cosmetics Europe, so that might be easier to search for Cosmetics Europe.
Yeah, really useful. Thank you so much for that. And I think, yes, somebody's put that in the chat as well. And I was just going to ask a question about, which I think I know the answer to, but I'm just interested to get your opinion. Do you see, because it's interesting that we're now playing catch up because of EU exit, right? And it's taken 4 years, but I do think we're getting hit with it now. Do you feel there's going to be a lot more divergence to come, or will it follow, or what do you think about that? Are we expecting more or not?
We always thought that if anyone changed their regulation, it would be the UK, and that we would truly diverge and go a completely new path. But because it's been quite slow here, and obviously it's looking like it will be, certain ones will obviously have to go first because it's not possible to do them all at the same time. If cosmetics are not at the front of that queue, there is actually a real risk that the EU will diverge from us, because they are now reviewing their legislation and could very well, because of the European Green Deal, make quite sweeping changes that we just don't have here. So there could be quite a difference.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So we're going to have to, I think the one piece of advice is you have to keep up to date, which can be overwhelming. And if we at the ICW team, or you want to contact Amanda and Layla from Bloom Regulatory as well, I think you need to expand your network and collaborate with others who know this stuff. You know, I personally, if anyone comes to me for cosmetics queries, I don't even try and answer it. I just pass it straight to Amanda and the team. And it's good to have that network of people that you can rely on. And I think definitely the ICW team support me a lot in terms of chemical queries that I have, or things that are just really, really complex and overwhelming. So I would recommend build your network and work with your colleagues around you to help with this, because you're not alone as well. I think there's a lot of information out there for everybody, and they're all finding it overwhelming. So yeah, good luck with that, everybody. Okay. On that note, I just want to thank you so much. And I also want to say thank you for pronouncing those chemicals so eloquently as well. I can't even speak in the basic words so eloquently, but the way you did it was very, very impressive. So thank you so much. Really, really interesting. And I hope everybody has a wonderful rest of their day. Thank you so much, Amanda and Layla.
Oh,